Welcome in, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on the request for proposals for SGC's Community Resilience Center's Technical Assistance Program. My name is Coral Abbott. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Community Resilience Center's Program Manager here at SGC. And I'm going to go over the kind of broad overview of the Community Resilience Centers, or CRC program, and then we'll really spend most of the time today, though, talking about the RFP. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here is our agenda for today. Again, we'll give a really brief overview of the current draft program guidelines, but encourage folks that want to understand more about the draft to watch our recorded draft guidelines webinar that's up on our YouTube channel. I'll leave this here. And then do just also want to note that that is the draft. We're in the process of finalizing the guidelines, and there are going to be a number of changes. So as I go over this, keep in mind some things will change between now and the final guidelines. And then just wanted to make sure that folks also know we'll be recording and sharing out today's webinar on the SGC YouTube channel for anybody that misses this opportunity today. Next slide, please. So the Community Resilience Centers, or CRC program, was established to provide funding for the construction or retrofit of facilities to serve as community resilience centers that mitigate the public health impacts of extreme heat and other emergency situations that are exacerbated by climate change, such as wildfire, power outages, or flooding. And then in addition to being open and accessible during climate and other emergencies, CRCs are also intended to build community resilience over the long term through programming and service distribution that build community resilience through activities that build social cohesion, economic resilience, and other supports that can help communities to weather the impacts of disasters as they continue to happen and increase in frequency. For this first round, we have roughly $100 million available for planning and implementation funding, and for future rounds, we're currently anticipating $160 million, although that may shift if the current state budget projections change. Next slide, please. So in December, our team released the round 1 draft guidelines for public comment. And since then, we've been incorporating input from public comment, meeting with subject matter experts and stakeholders, and our interagency partners to develop the final draft, which we'll be bringing to our council for adoption in late April. And then we intend to release initial applications in May with the pre-proposal due in June, followed by the full proposal due in late summer, and anticipate making round 1 awards in winter, likely December of this year. Next slide, please. So to provide a little more detail on our grants for this first round, roughly $95 million will be available for implementation grants and roughly $5 million for planning grants. Implementation grants in the draft guidelines are proposed to range from $5 to $10 million each, although again, this number may shift for the final guidelines. And then planning grants are proposed to range from $200,000 to $500,000. And then a note that qualifying community-based organizations will be eligible for advance payment up to 25% of the grant total. Next slide, please. So core components for our program include the following, many of which come directly from statute. Multi-stakeholder partnerships, which again in legislation, it states that they need to include local residents and community-based organizations in governance and decision-making. Robust, meaningful, and culturally appropriate community engagement throughout all phases. That means starting with the application all the way through implementation of the projects. Capital projects, which is the umbrella term referring to the physical infrastructure investments to the CRC facility itself. So the building, as well as what we're calling campus amenities, which can range, but are elements that support use of the center, like a bus stop or a community garden. And then community resilience services and programs is the umbrella term for social infrastructure investments in services and programs to ensure ongoing year-round use of the Resilience Center while strengthening local community resilience. Next slide, please. So all communities are eligible to apply under the program. Anywhere in the state, anyone can get funded. But again, per statute, there will be priority given to under-resourced communities, which are defined in our guidelines, but include disadvantaged or low-income communities, and then a third definition for disadvantaged/low income. But then we've added on to that layer an emphasis on under-resourced communities that are also unincorporated communities, rural communities, located on tribal lands, and then also want to note that we have a tribal funding target to fund at least 2 tribally led projects across our implementation and planning grants. Next slide, please. So that was the extremely high-level overview of the details of the grants. Again, really encourage folks to read the draft guidelines, watch that webinar to go over the details. But for the application process, which will obviously play heavily into the technical assistance part of the work, for implementation grants, we have a 2-phase application process with a very simple pre-proposal to start. At this phase, we won't provide applicants with a score, but instead we'll provide feedback on the likelihood of readiness for round 1. We might also at this point recommend applicants instead apply for planning grants if they're not likely to be ready or pass threshold for round 1 implementation grants. And then at that point, following the pre-proposal phase, we'll assign technical assistance and look at some factors included in the pre-proposal, as well as other factors like capacity of the applicant teams and priority community status. And just a note, we'll cover this later as well, but program staff and TA providers will work together to develop the criteria and selection process for who receives TA. Next slide, please. Then for the planning grants, rather than requiring a pre-proposal, we're instead just offering an optional technical assistance intake survey, so more directly focused on understanding who's applying for TA and what the needs are. The full application for these grants will include a narrative, a work plan, community engagement plan, a budget, and documentation of the applicant's capacity. And the threshold review will primarily focus on the eligibility of applicants and project activities. So definitely still plenty of content to prepare, but much less intensive in some ways than the implementation grant applications might be. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll go over the RFP itself. Next slide. So the purpose of this program's application technical assistance is to provide TA and capacity building support to potential applicants from under-resourced communities and other priority communities and organization types, such as community-based organizations. It includes technical assistance provided for round 1 applicants to the program, so folks directly preparing an application for round 1, as well as capacity building services in support of potential round 2 applicants. So we'll get into the difference between that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So the scope of work is split into 3 main tasks. Task 1 is just the broad administration, coordination, and reporting that's needed for the contract itself, including meeting with SGC for the kickoff, regular updates, quarterly and final report preparation and submission, etc. Task 2, though, is where the bulk of the work for the contract will come in. This is direct application assistance for both planning and implementation grant applicants. As the RFP lays out, this will involve guidance to applicants on how to scope out their project, community engagement strategies, facilitation between possible project partners, and then general grant preparation project management, including getting clear with applicants on the timeline for completing the application and milestones that might need to be met along the way. Assessing project eligibility and readiness and ability to meet some of those thresholds, tracking the documentation that's needed to submit with the application, and then work plan and budget review. Also technical expertise related to capital improvement development, resilient energy infrastructure options, water and wastewater system design, emergency management and operations, and workforce development. And then task 3 is going to focus on supporting possible round 2 applicants to build capacity to apply to round 2 of the program through much higher level activities like the development of shareable resources and then bringing folks together for consultations, roundtables, convenings, and trainings. So very much more focused on training and providing resources rather than direct application development and kind of project management of the application process. Next slide, please. And so we're asking that bidders assemble teams that can demonstrate experience with providing technical assistance and grant writing support, urban planning and community development, and then managing infrastructure development projects. Working directly with stakeholders in disadvantaged, low-income, rural, tribal, and unincorporated communities in California, developing partnerships and facilitating community engagement, and then finally subject matter expertise in energy and water infrastructure, emergency management and operations, and workforce development. This experience pretty directly reflects the scope of work and the skills that are needed to perform that. But one thing I did want to clarify is we're not expecting the TA provider to write the grant materials for applicants or to conduct community engagement for them. We want them to have the experience to be able to advise them appropriately and provide guidance and feedback along the way. Next slide, please. So the evaluation criteria will look just broadly at the clarity and organization of the proposal. And then a big piece of it will be the approach to the scope of work, including a detailed project management plan with a qualified project manager and methodology and approach for each task. And then the work plan, schedule, and budget justification. Next slide, please. And then this will also evaluate the proposer and team experience. This is going to be directly scoring for the qualifications and desired experience or knowledge that I detailed a couple of slides back. And then with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague John to cover what is going to be needed to prepare a complete bid.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is John. I'm responsible for the administrative part of this solicitation. Next slide. Going to jump into a little bit about what should be included in your proposal. So the proposal itself has multiple components that are required and listed on this page. All of them are vital, some of them more than others. And if you do forget some of these, you will be disqualified, which is why we'll be going over them today. The title page, letter of commitment, and table of contents are all pretty straightforward. The proposal checklist is also very simple. It allows us and you to ensure there's nothing missing before you submit and as we begin the review of the proposals. The response to the scope of work is where a really large portion of the overall submission should be. This should detail your methodology and approach to the work in response to the higher level scope laid out in the RFP. This should also reflect and consider the scoring criteria that was just went over a moment ago, and we'll talk about that more later. You'll need to include your qualifications, such as minimum qualifications, your personnel, team resumes, and reference forms. Program will want to see your work plan, work schedule, budget justification, and as mentioned earlier, we'll be evaluating this to evaluate the effectiveness and feasibility of your approach. You must also include the budget and cost detail as part of the proposal with enough detail for us to evaluate it. And you'll need to include all of your required attachments, which I'll go over in a second. Next slide. So response to the scope of work, I won't go over this whole thing, but as we mentioned earlier, this will be recorded and posted. So if you want to come back and look at this slide, please feel free. Something important to note is that the project management plan should include subcontractors and the name of your project manager. Next slide. For your minimum qualifications, we'll need to see proof, describe the relevant work of the proposed team members. We'll also want to see personnel and team resumes. And the proposer references form requires at least 3 references to be included. This is required for the proposer and each subcontractor on the proposal. Next slide. For your budget, please use the budget template, which is in the event package for the RFP listed on Cal eProcure. This slide includes some information on some costs we typically might see in proposals that might help us to evaluate it. As a reminder, the maximum amount available for this contract is $300,000 for the 2 funding rounds, so please plan your budget accordingly. You will need to use the Cal HR travel and per diem expenses, which can be found at a website that we'll post in the comments shortly. Next slide. And these are the attachments listed in the event package. Some of them are not required, such as the TACPA and other things, but the most important one here is the bidder declaration at number 6. If you do not have this in your proposal, we'll be forced to disqualify you. State contracting rules are pretty clear about this. Also, the excuse me, I got a little sidetracked here. So yes, the most important attachment is number 6, the bidder declaration. Without this in your proposal, you'll be disqualified. And then next slide, please. I did just want to go over really quickly here. The deadline for the proposal is 5 o'clock on the dot on April 21st. We've run into some issues in the past with bidders getting in their proposals past 5 o'clock, but a couple seconds after, and we were forced to disqualify them. So please get it in as early as you can so we don't run into any issues and have to disqualify you.
Great. And then I think I'll just really quickly, note and reiterate that we anticipate that we'll post our notice of intent award on May 8th and hope we can begin the contract around early June, which should hopefully line up with our application timeline with the full application period. So with that, would love to take some time for questions. We have some that were submitted to the contracts inbox, which we can definitely go over, but maybe just for the sake of time, we will be posting those, I think, on Monday of next week. And so for the folks here, would love to hear any questions that you have so that we can answer those today. Anything? Maybe one thing I'll quickly note to make sure folks are aware if you're thinking about putting together a bid is that we, if you're intending to be a technical assistance provider that is kind of a part of this contract and you're being paid by the state via this contract, you can't be a subrecipient or recipient of grant funds. So if you're helping to prepare applications under this technical assistance contract, you can't apply for grant funding in round 1 or round 2, or even be kind of a subrecipient of the funding. So just want to make sure that folks are aware of that before deciding whether or not to submit a bid. Yeah, Kate.
Thanks, Coral. I was just curious, I know that this particular RFP is for round 1 and round 2. Is there any, I guess, decision on whether TA will be offered in following rounds?
Yes, definitely. And I think that we will also provide like more robust application TA for round 2 as well. That's like really helping with the project management piece. But because we are such a new program and there's a potential that things could change significantly from round 1 to round 2, I think we just decided to parse out the RFP into mostly looking at round 1 and then reassessing to see if there are additional like skills or needs for round 2 based on how the program guidelines change.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question. Other questions that folks on the line have? Yeah, I just want to point to John's point in the chat that you can still send us questions after the Q&A is ended. The best place to reach us is at the contracts@opr.ca.gov inbox. That way John can figure out if this is a program question to send it our way, but if it's a contract team question, should be able to answer it directly. Any additional questions from anyone on the line? Okay, well, yeah, and then if you do have program questions, our team's email is crc@sgc.ca.gov. So if you have questions as you're reviewing the draft or going over the webinar recording, you can send those our way. But then for questions related to the contracting and bidding process, like maybe if you have questions about the 5 p.m. deadline or which attachments you need to include, please send those to contracts@opr.ca.gov. I think they are best equipped to handle those and to answer those. Great. So I think, like we mentioned before, we will be answering the questions that have been submitted so far to our team about this RFP and posting them. The goal is on Monday to post answers to those questions. So we'll make sure to share those out to the folks here. If you haven't already, also really encourage folks to sign up for our CRC listserv. And we can pull in a link for that quickly. I'll see if I can find that. But that's a good way to make sure you're getting updates from our team. The variety of opportunities for grants and for contracts. And if any changes, hopefully we're in the clear, but if we do end up needing to make changes, we'll make sure to post that and send an email here. So here's okay, John or anyone else on the team, any additional stuff we want to add before we maybe wrap up today?
No, I don't think so. If anyone has any contracts questions, they know where to find me.
Great. Right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And yeah, please do reach out if you have questions that continue to come up. And we will make sure to post those answers on Monday. So we'll try to make sure we can kind of capture everybody who was here so we can follow up with you as well. But do encourage you to sign up for that listserv to make sure we have your contact information. Okay, well, with that, thanks so much for joining, everybody, and looking forward to reviewing your proposals.
Coral?
Hi.
Hi, it's Susan Silver. I wasn't able to get on until about 2 minutes ago. Are you going to be sending out the recording?
Yes.
For the slide presentation?
Yes, I think we will be doing that. Yeah, we recorded the initial presentation and then the Q&A, so I think we can share those out to the folks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a couple people that were not able to get on.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we'll make sure to send that out along with the Q&A answers as well.
Okay, cool. And when can we expect the recording? Just curious about that.
I think that's a live question that we need to work with our communications team to understand when they can post it, but hopefully around the same time as we post the Q&A answers, as long as there's tech issues.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Take care, everyone.